December 21, 1970. Elvis Presley boards a red-eye flight to Washington, D.C., carrying a handwritten letter and a loaded Colt .45 pistol. He's about to walk into the White House unannounced and ask President Nixon for something nobody saw coming. Christmas, 1970. If you were alive in December 1970, you remember what America felt like. The country was tearing itself apart. Vietnam War protests filled the streets. Young people were rejecting everything their parents' generation stood for. Drug culture was exploding. The generation gap felt like a canyon nobody could cross. And Elvis Presley, the 35-year-old king of rock and roll, was struggling to figure out where he fit in all of it. He'd been back from the army for 10 years. He'd made dozens of movies, most of them forgettable. He'd done the '68 comeback special that reminded people he could still perform. But privately, Elvis felt lost. He felt like the world was changing in ways he didn't understand and couldn't control. On the night of December 20th, 1970, Elvis was at Graceland with his wife Priscilla and their 2-year-old daughter Lisa Marie. They were preparing for Christmas. The tree was up, presents were being wrapped, everything looked perfect from the outside. But Elvis was restless, anxious. He'd been reading newspapers obsessively, watching the news, getting more and more agitated about what he saw as America falling apart. Kids on drugs, protests turning violent, respect for authority crumbling. According to people close to him, Elvis started pacing Graceland that night, talking about wanting to do something meaningful, something to help his country. Priscilla tried to calm him down. It was almost Christmas. They had family coming. Couldn't he just relax? But Elvis couldn't relax. Around midnight, he made a decision that stunned everyone in the house. He announced he was flying to Washington, D.C., right now, tonight. Priscilla thought he was joking. "Elvis, it's the middle of the night." "I need to talk to President Nixon," Elvis said, completely serious. "I need to offer my help." And before anyone could talk him out of it, Elvis Presley walked out of Graceland, drove to the Memphis airport, and bought a first-class ticket on the next flight to Los Angeles, then connecting to Washington, D.C. He left behind a stunned wife, a confused staff, and a half-decorated Christmas tree. The flight. Elvis boarded American Airlines Flight 82 wearing a purple velvet suit, a cape, and enough jewelry to stock a small store. He carried a Colt .45 pistol in his luggage, perfectly legal back then, and wore his police badge collection on his belt. On the plane, sitting in first class, Elvis pulled out some American Airlines stationery and started writing. Not notes, not a speech, a letter. To the President of the United States. The letter, which still exists in the National Archives today, is one of the strangest documents in presidential history. Written in Elvis's looping handwriting, it reads like a stream of consciousness from a man who genuinely believes he can help save America. Elvis wrote about how he'd been studying drug culture and communist brainwashing techniques. He offered to go undercover to help fight the hippie movement. He explained that he could reach young people in ways the government couldn't because he understood their music, their culture, their language. And then came the request that would change everything. Elvis asked President Nixon to make him a federal agent at large for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. He wanted a federal badge, official credentials, the authority to help fight drugs. Then Elvis does something that makes the Secret Service agents freeze. When the plane landed at LAX for his connection, Elvis called some friends in Los Angeles. By the time he reached D.C., he'd gathered a small entourage, Jerry Schilling and Sonny West, 2 of his Memphis Mafia guys who'd rushed to meet him. They arrived in Washington on the morning of December 21st. Elvis checked into the Hotel Washington, then told Jerry and Sonny his plan. They were going to the White House. "Elvis," Jerry said carefully, "you can't just walk into the White House." "Watch me," Elvis replied. The letter delivery. At 6:30 a.m., Elvis walked up to the northwest gate of the White House, carrying his handwritten letter in an envelope. A guard on duty recognized him immediately. "Mr. Presley? I have a letter for President Nixon," Elvis said, handing over the envelope. "It's important. Please make sure he gets it." The guard, probably thinking this was the strangest morning of his career, accepted the letter and assured Elvis it would be delivered. Elvis thanked him, turned around, and walked back to his hotel. Inside the White House, the letter made its way through the system. A deputy counsel named Eagle Bud Krogh read it first. His reaction was probably a mix of confusion and fascination. Here was Elvis Presley, offering to work as an undercover federal agent. What Elvis writes in that letter stuns everyone who reads it. Krogh showed the letter to other staff members. Some laughed. Some thought it was a prank. But Krogh saw an opportunity. Elvis Presley wanted to support the Nixon administration's anti-drug efforts. That was good publicity. That was a photo op Nixon could use. Krogh wrote a memo recommending that Nixon meet with Elvis. "It will take very little of your time," Krogh wrote, "and it can be extremely beneficial." By late morning, the decision was made. President Nixon would meet Elvis Presley. That afternoon, in the Oval Office. A White House aide called Elvis's hotel. "Mr. Presley, the president will see you at 12:30 p.m. Elvis hung up the phone and turned to Jerry and Sonny with a huge smile. "Boys, we're meeting the president." Were you alive in 1970? Do you remember the tensions between young people and the older generation during that time? Share your memories in the comments. And if you're enjoying these incredible untold Elvis stories, make sure you're subscribed. We're just getting started. The Oval Office meeting. Inside the Oval Office, the meeting gets stranger by the minute. At 12:30 p.m. on December 21, 1970, Elvis Presley walked into the Oval Office wearing his purple velvet suit, massive belt buckle, and sunglasses. President Richard Nixon stood up from his desk, extending his hand. According to the official notes taken during the meeting, the conversation started awkwardly. Nixon, a man who knew almost nothing about rock and roll, tried to make small talk. Elvis, nervous and rambling, talked about how he'd started his career, how music had changed, how he wanted to help the country. Then Elvis started giving Nixon gifts. He'd brought a Colt .45 pistol, which Secret Service had already confiscated but promised to return, and a collection of photographs. Nixon, looking slightly overwhelmed, accepted them politely. Elvis launched into his pitch. He explained that the Beatles had been a negative influence on young people, that their anti-American statements during their U.S. tours had damaged the country. He said he wanted to help counter that influence. Nixon nodded along, probably not sure where this was going. Then Elvis got to the point. "Mr. President, I'd like to be helpful. I'd like you to make me a federal agent at large for the Bureau of Narcotics. I can reach people the government can't reach." There was a moment of silence. Nixon looked at his aides. The aides looked at each other. This was not a normal request. But Nixon, always the politician, saw the value. Having Elvis Presley publicly aligned with his anti-drug campaign? That was worth something, even if the agent title was purely symbolic. Nixon turned to Krogh. "Bud, can we get him a badge?" Krogh nodded. "Yes, Mr. President." Elvis's face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. The meeting lasted about 30 minutes. They talked about Elvis's concerns for America's youth, about the drug problem, about patriotism and service. Nixon later wrote in his diary that Elvis was strange but sincere. Before Elvis left, a photographer was brought in. Nixon and Elvis shook hands. The camera flashed. Neither man had any idea that this photograph would become one of the most famous images in American history. The badge. After leaving the Oval Office, Elvis was escorted to the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs headquarters. There, officials presented him with a BNDD badge and credential card identifying him as a special assistant. Elvis was thrilled. He now had a federal badge to add to his collection. He called Priscilla immediately. "Baby, I did it. I met with President Nixon. And I got the badge. Priscilla, still back in Memphis trying to salvage Christmas, could only sigh. "That's wonderful, Elvis. Are you coming home now?" "Soon," Elvis promised. But first, he had to go shopping. Elvis hit the DC stores, buying Christmas gifts for everyone, staff members, friends, family. He was in the best mood Jerry and Sonny had seen in months. He kept pulling out his new federal badge, showing it to strangers, beaming with pride. On the flight back to Memphis, Elvis sat in first class, badge in hand, feeling like he'd accomplished something important. He'd met the president. He'd been given federal credentials. He was now officially part of the fight against drugs in America. The irony, of course, was devastating. Even as Elvis carried that badge, his own prescription drug use was spiraling out of control. The pills that would eventually kill him were already taking their toll. He genuinely believed he was fighting drug abuse while simultaneously being consumed by it. But in that moment, on that plane, Elvis felt purposeful, patriotic, needed. The aftermath. The White House kept the meeting secret at first. No press release, no announcement. Nixon's staff figured it was just a weird celebrity drop-in, not worth publicizing. But the photograph existed, and eventually it leaked. And the photograph that results becomes one of the most requested images in American history. By the late 1980s, that image of Elvis and Nixon shaking hands had become the single most requested photograph from the National Archives. More requested than pictures of moon landings, more than famous presidential moments, more than anything else in the collection. Why? Because it perfectly captured something absurd and quintessentially American: the president and the king. The ultimate establishment figure and the original rock and roll rebel. Both of them uncomfortable, both of them trying to use each other, both of them believing they were doing something important. The letter Elvis wrote on that airplane is now displayed in a museum. The badge he received sits in a vault at Graceland. And that photograph hangs in diners, bars, and homes across America, a reminder of one of the strangest meetings in White House history. What he was really looking for. Looking back now, it's easy to see what was really happening that December day. Elvis wasn't just looking for a badge. He was looking for purpose, for validation, for a way to feel like he mattered beyond the music and the movies and the fame. He'd watched Martin Luther King Jr. get assassinated in his hometown of Memphis. He'd watched Bobby Kennedy fall the same year. He'd seen the country convulse with violence and protest, and he felt helpless. The badge gave him the illusion of control, of being on the side of order and goodness, of fighting the chaos. But you can't fight chaos with a symbolic badge. You can't save a country from the darkness when you're drowning in your own. And Elvis, generous, patriotic, sincere Elvis, never understood that the fight he needed to win was the one inside himself. Still, there's something touching about his earnestness, about a man who genuinely believed that if the president just gave him the right credentials, he could help save American youth from going down the wrong path. Was he naive? Absolutely. Was he hypocritical? In hindsight, tragically so. But was he sincere? Every person who was in that Oval Office that day said the same thing. Elvis Presley genuinely wanted to help. He just didn't know how. The photograph of Elvis and Nixon remains one of the most iconic images of the 1970s. Not because it shows two powerful men, but because it shows two human beings, both flawed, both struggling, both trying to control a world that was slipping away from them. If this story gave you a new perspective on Elvis, please share it. And if you lived through the 1970s, if you remember what that era felt like, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Subscribe for more untold Elvis stories that go beyond the music and into the complicated, fascinating, heartbreaking human being behind the legend. Because the more you learn about Elvis Presley, the more you realize he was never just the king. He was a man searching for meaning in a world that wanted him to be a symbol. Thank you for watching, and remember, even legends get lost sometimes.